Okay, so in our last class, we talked about the life of Alexander the Great, the actual person, Alexander the Great, and the background of Plutarch, the author whose biography of Alexander you read. So today what we're going to do is talk about the text itself. And to start with, it's important to situate where the life of Alexander fits in Plutarch's much larger project of writing the parallel lives. So we talked last time about how the parallel lives work. They put together the life of a famous Greek and a famous Roman who were thought by Plutarch to have a similar character. And they were introduced with a short paragraph or two talking about why Plutarch grouped them together. And then the lives went in a particular order. They started with the Greek life, then the Roman life followed it, and then finally Plutarch concluded the pair of lives with a short conclusion that compared the two and talked about what was similar and what was different in the lives of the two characters, and what lessons might be learned about the characteristics that these people embodied. So the project was begun somewhere between 96 and 99 AD, when Plutarch was in his mid-50s. And the pairings were published in groups. And so these were published kind of as almost individual books, like a first edition, a second edition, and so on. So sometime around 96, a batch of 10 pairs appeared. And these included famous figures like Cicero, the Alexander and Julius Caesar pair. So we'll read Alexander this week, Julius Caesar next week. That pair belongs to the second group, which was a batch of 6 lives published around the year 100 AD. So as you know, this life was written almost 450 years after Alexander's death. And so Plutarch is as close a witness to Alexander's life as you are to Shakespeare. But if this is the case, what we have to understand is that Plutarch is working off of a different kind of set of sources than he would if he's writing about a contemporary. So if we were to write a biography of Shakespeare, we couldn't write it ourselves from our own memories. None of us obviously have met Shakespeare. So what we would need to do is go back and find sources for Shakespeare's life that we could use. And Plutarch faced the same problem. He had to write about Alexander, who was absolutely one of the most famous people in the history of the world, without any personal recollection of the man or the events of his life. And so this meant that, like us, what Plutarch had to do to build his life of Alexander was read things that other people had already said about Alexander. And so Plutarch was very interested in trying to get better insight into Alexander by looking at sources that were supposedly written by him or by people who knew him. This is the way that Plutarch wanted to bridge that 400-year gap. So modern scholars have disassembled the life of Alexander to get a sense of what Plutarch was actually reading. And what they've found is there are more than 30 different sources that Plutarch uses in this text. Now, most of those sources are cited only once. And so scholars suspect that Plutarch is actually relying pretty heavily on a couple of sources for most of his basic material, and then he's adding in details as he sees that fit. But the source that's cited the most is something called the Letters of Alexander the Great. And this is a collection of letters, supposedly written by Alexander the Great during his lifetime, that first appeared in the world sometime in the 1st century BC. Now that timing is, of course, suspicious. Alexander died in the 4th century BC. So these texts are showing up like 300 years after he died. And it's suspicious because this text is a forgery. These are not actually letters written by Alexander the Great in the 4th century. Instead, they're part of a later document that someone put together to sell books in the 1st century BC. But unfortunately, Plutarch either didn't know that this collection was fake, or more likely he didn't actually care, because he cited the Alexander letters over 30 times in the life of Alexander the Great. No other source is cited more than 6 times. And some of this is undoubtedly due to the fact that the letters of Alexander the Great give evidence that supported the particular view for Alexander's character that Plutarch was arguing. So Plutarch, again, is making an argument, and he's particularly concerned that people believe that what he says is actually true. So he wants to dominate the text so that you go into its world and you see only the Alexander that he wants you to see. And so this meant that he often had to deal with ideas that people already had about Alexander that conflicted with what Plutarch wanted them to believe about Alexander's character. In some places, Plutarch's main narrative source will say something that Plutarch doesn't think is true, or which contradicts Plutarch's vision of what Alexander was. And so in these cases, what Plutarch tries to do is dismiss this counter-evidence that undercuts the argument he's making about Alexander. And so when this happens, Plutarch tries to tell his readers that he's not entirely sure that the information provided in this contradictory source is trustworthy. So, for example, in a passage debating whether the philosopher Antipater tried to poison Alexander because Alexander was becoming autocratic, Plutarch writes, "As far as suspicions of poisoning, no one had any suspicions immediately. But those who say that Aristotle counseled Antipater to do the deed and that it was entirely through this agency that the poison was provided, they mention one Hagnothemus as their authority, a person who professed to have heard the story from Antigonus the king. And, according to this story, the poison was water, icy cold, from a certain cliff in Ninacris. This they gathered up in a delicate dew and stored it in an ass's hoof, for no other vessel would hold the water, but all would be eaten through it, owing to its coldness and its pungency." But then Plutarch goes on. "Most writers, however, think the story of the poisoning is altogether a fabrication, and it's no slight evidence in their favor that during the dissensions of Alexander's commanders, which lasted for many days, his body, although it lay without special care in places that were moist and stifling, showed no signs of destructive influence, but remained pure and fresh." And so what you see here is Plutarch taking a tradition that is really detrimental to the picture of Alexander that he wants, and destroying it. Now, Alexander, of course, in Plutarch's view, is supposed to be a philosophically inspired, just Greek king. And this tradition that Aristotle, the foremost philosopher of that particular moment in history, actually wanted him dead, completely undercuts this idea that he was a philosophical king. After all, why would a philosopher want to kill a philosophical king? And so what Plutarch does is he tells the story, but he tells it in a way that is absolutely absurd. So the idea that this is a poison that comes from a cliff that you gather together and store in an ass's hoof, this is of course ridiculous. And Plutarch knows it's ridiculous. He's telling you this because he wants you to understand that it's ridiculous. And especially because this poison is supposed to be so abrasive or so toxic that it eats through everything except ass's hoofs. And so Plutarch says, well, everybody basically, aside from this one source, agrees that this story is completely made up. There's no evidence at all for this. And actually, there's good counter evidence for this. Because if this actually was such an abrasive poison, it wouldn't have just stayed in Alexander's body. Yeah, it would have killed him, but then it would have eaten through the body as well, in the same way that if you eat acid, it will eat through your body. It won't just sort of kill you and leave your body intact. But Alexander's body wasn't eaten through by anything, and so therefore this story can't be true. And so what Plutarch is doing here is actually quite strategic. Plutarch knew that people had heard the story that Aristotle and Antipater had wanted Alexander killed. He knew that if they heard this story and he didn't say anything about it, it would undercut the strength of his argument. People would start to suspect that Plutarch wasn't giving them a full picture of who Alexander was because they'd heard this story and Plutarch doesn't address it. And so what Plutarch has to do is address this story, but do it in a way that presents the story in a way that is completely unbelievable. And so that's what Plutarch does. He presents the evidence, he tells it in a way that is true to what he read, but he also tells it in a way that highlights how unlikely and absurd the story is, and then he offers counter evidence to show that it can't absolutely be possible for this to happen in any way. And so what you see here is how Plutarch deals with counter-argument. There is a counter-argument to his portrayal of Alexander. It's the counter-argument of the philosophers trying to poison him, and Plutarch acknowledges the counter-argument and then destroys it. And in that way, Plutarch keeps control of the text and makes it possible for you to understand that Plutarch actually is true to the character of Alexander, even though there are stories that might seem to counteract it. So this is one of the strategies that you see an ancient biographer use to try to maintain control of the picture within the text that he's writing. The next thing that we should do is turn to how you decode the biography. So last time and last week, we talked about the basic sort of structure, the pattern of a biography. So what you see on this slide is the organizational structure of the life of Alexander. And you can see that this follows more or less the structure that we talked about and the pattern that we talked about. So you have the preface where Plutarch introduces the text, the family background, the birth of Alexander, the physical appearance of Alexander, the education of Alexander, and then the beginning of his career. And then you get to the bulk of the portrait of Alexander. These are the events of the Persian campaign, the Indian campaign, and the actions in Persia. And then we have a short conclusion that talks about the death of Alexander and tries to sum this entire thing up. And so the progression of the work should be pretty familiar to you. But the way that this is presented is, of course, pretty typical. And when you read the life of Caesar, what you'll see is this structure is more or less there. The life of Caesar, as we'll talk about next week, doesn't have its beginning, but in a sense that doesn't matter because the structure is so basic and so consistent that you know how that argument would have developed anyway. And so the portrait that Plutarch is giving you is a picture of Alexander that presents him as a Greek king who ruled in a just Greek way for most of his career. In the longest part of the biography, the part of the biography that looks at the conquest of the Persian Empire, shows Alexander manifesting these virtues. And these are virtues that Plutarch has set up from the outset of the text. So in the preface, where he talks about the nature of the project, and then in the family background of Alexander, what Plutarch does is he sets up this ideal of Alexander as the just, virtuous Greek king. We hear about his birth, we hear about the importance of his greatness, we hear about his physical appearance and his intellectual gifts. And when we get into the discussion of the conquest of the Persian Empire, all of these great skills and attributes that Alexander possesses are being brought into the world, and they are guiding him as he undertakes this campaign. But after the Persian Empire is conquered, what we begin to see is Alexander starts losing his way. He transforms from a visionary, moral, and capable leader from the early biography into something of a suspicious and violent person who murders or signs off on the execution of some of his closest advisors. This ultimately leads to the invasion of India, which Plutarch sees as a completely unnecessary war that was designed mainly to soothe Alexander's ego. And then when Alexander's men mutiny, Plutarch describes Alexander unraveling. And this is the moment where you begin to see the just and virtuous Greek king begin to be transformed into something different. And so Plutarch talks briefly about how once he's back in Persia, Alexander starts adopting some Persian mannerisms, he sidelines Greeks, and ultimately he becomes dominated by the empire he defeated. But he dies of a fever before much of consequence comes of this, and he dies, of course, in Babylon. And so this is the story. But the interesting thing for Plutarch is not so much the progression of the story, but the way in which the story is told. Because what Plutarch is interested in doing is providing anecdotes that point to details about Alexander. And he makes sure that these anecdotes are sprinkled throughout the biography at regular intervals so that the readers will never forget that the work is actually about Alexander's character and the demonstration of his virtue. And so this begins early in the text, where Plutarch gives you a description of the background of Alexander. And what you see is he's a descendant of Hercules on his father's side, which means, of course, because Hercules is a child of Zeus, he's descended from Zeus himself. And on his mother's side, he's a descendant of heroes as well. And so on both sides, Alexander is ultimately descended from the gods. Now, this is, of course, insane. And it's not even something that you necessarily have to literally believe is true. Instead, what you're getting is a portrait of who Alexander seemed to be a portrait of his character through his genealogy. And the genealogy is something that Philip and his wife Olympias would have claimed. And the story, of course, of Philip having a dream that that Zeus put a seal on his wife's womb, and the device of the seal was a figure of a lion. Well, this is quite interesting, right? But it's also something that Plutarch doesn't need you to believe to be literally true. What he wants you to understand is that Alexander is special, and that basically Alexander is the product of some sort of a divine birth. The seal on Olympias's womb means that Philip is, his father in a way, but in the same way that Joseph is the father of Jesus. The actual father of Alexander, according to Plutarch's story, is a god. And the sign of the lion is a symbol of Hercules, but also a symbol that will come to be a symbol of Alexander. And there's Alexander wearing the lion skin, symbolizing Hercules. This is one of the most common coins issued in all of antiquity, and so this is the picture of Alexander that basically everybody would be familiar with. Now, when Plutarch talks about Alexander's birth, he gives a really interesting story. He tells the story of the burning of the Temple of Ephesian Artemis. Now, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, this is one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And the burning of the temple is a very well-known event. It's something that's done by a man named Herostratus, who did it basically because he wanted to be famous. And so this becomes a proverbial story of basically a proverbial story showing that fame doesn't actually mean much of anything. Because Herostratus wanted to become famous, he burned something beautiful and sacred so that he could become famous. He became famous, but nothing good came out of it. And so the story of Herostratus is, again, a story everybody has heard. It's a proverbial story that all Greeks would be familiar with, especially by the time of Plutarch. But Plutarch says something quite interesting. He says that the temple of Ephesian Artemis was burned on the day that Alexander was born. And it's because of this that Hegesias, the Magnesian, made an utterance that's frigid enough to have extinguished that great conflagration. He said it was no wonder that the Temple of Artemis was burned down, since the goddess was busy bringing Alexander into the world. And so what that means is Artemis wasn't at the temple. She was actually there to witness Alexander's birth, and this is why the temple could burn down. But intriguingly, all the Persian magi who were then at Ephesus, they looked upon the temple's disaster as a sign of further disaster, and they ran around beating their faces and crying aloud that a great calamity for Asia had been born on that day. And so Plutarch gives us this anecdote for a couple of reasons. The first is because it reinforces this idea that Alexander's birth was divinely sanctioned, and that the gods were present when he was born because they were so interested in his birth that they neglected everything else, including their own temples. But the second part of this also points to the future of Alexander's career. So the Magi are Persian priests, and Ephesus is a Greek city, but at this point, it's of course under Persian control. And so the Persian Magi are there superintending religious activities as they would in many other cities in the Persian Empire. And so their prediction that Asia will suffer great calamity because of Alexander's birth, of course, is also true. And Plutarch is here foreshadowing what Alexander will do to the Persian Empire. And his readers, of course, know this. And so this is a story that not only reinforces the picture that Plutarch has given, that Alexander is divinely born, but also highlights how that's connected to what Alexander will ultimately achieve. So as we move into the next part of the biography, what we see is it reinforces Alexander's great natural talent, his fiery temperament, and his incredible ambition. So his physical appearance, Plutarch describes as being one that exudes a pleasant odor. This pleasant odor exhaled from his skin so that there was a fragrance about his mouth and all his flesh. And his garments were filled with this fragrance, and this we've read in the memoirs of Aristoxenus. Now, the cause of this, perhaps, was the temperament of his body, which was a very warm and fiery one. For the fragrance is generated, as Theophrastus thinks, where moist humors are acted upon by heat. So, wherefore the dry and parched regions of the world produce the most and best spices, for the sun draws away the moisture which, like the material of corruption, abounds in vegetable bodies. In Alexander's case, it was the heat of his body, so it would seem, which made him prone to drink and angry. Now, this is one of the crazier things that Plutarch ever writes, and he writes some crazy things. Basically, when he's talking about Alexander's physical presentation, he talks about how Alexander has this kind of pleasant fragrance about him. Now, that's kind of neither here nor there, right? Physiognomy doesn't do anything with pleasant fragrances. But Plutarch is telling this story for a particular reason, because Alexander's alcoholism is, of course, widely known, and it would become such a great problem that Plutarch would have to acknowledge that this is something that dominates parts of Alexander's career and actually influences Alexander's career in a pretty negative way. And the fact that Alexander becomes an out-of-control alcoholic undercuts the idea that Plutarch wants you to have, that Alexander is a philosophically inspired, just king who merged ambition with justice, someone who is virtuous, not vicious. And an angry, aggressive alcoholic tends not to be seen by people in antiquity as virtuous. Certainly not as temperate, which is what Plutarch wants you to believe Alexander is. And so Plutarch then dismisses the claim that Alexander had a drinking problem. And he does it in a particularly crazy way. He says basically that Alexander didn't have a drinking problem, he had a body heat problem. And because his body was very warm and very fiery, he had to drink a lot. Because of course, he had to drink a lot. That was just what happened. And so he drank a lot because he had this sort of overheating body, and this made him prone to drink, and sometimes, of course, it made him angry as well. But that great pleasant odor that comes from him, that's the proof that you need to show you that Alexander actually does have this condition that requires him to drink a lot because he has to quench the flames of his body. Now, what's also interesting about this is how Plutarch builds up a series of sources to make this really ridiculous claim seem like it's persuasive. So the Memoirs of Aristoxenus, well, this is a text, it's an authoritative text that dates back to one of the people who knew Alexander in his life. And so if Aristoxenus says that Alexander had a pleasant, fragrant odor about him, well, then we have to believe that. So Plutarch gives you a source, and that seems to be proof of the fragrance. Now, what does this fragrant odor have to do with the alcoholism? Well, then Plutarch cites Theophrastus. And Theophrastus is the premier natural scientist of the Greek, the Greek world and the Hellenic world. And so the Memoirs of Aristoxenus give you the information that Alexander had a pleasant odor, and then Theophrastus, the naturalist, tells you, well, when you have that kind of pleasant odor, it has to be because of this extreme heat that is soaking away or taking away the moisture from something. And so then Plutarch concludes, well, it's just natural that pleasant odor that Aristoxenus says he has, it must be caused by this sort of overheating body, as Theophrastus describes. And so what you have here is an argument that is ridiculous, but it's also an argument that's structured in such a way that it seems like it might be plausible. The point that Plutarch has, though, is that, well, I'll make this argument, but before you have time to think about it, I'm going to move on to something else. And so this is a way of dismissing the implication that Alexander was an out-of-control alcoholic by creating this kind of sleight of hand. So you don't actually pay too much attention to the implications of that particular point of information. And then immediately Plutarch moves to something else. You might believe that Alexander was an out-of-control alcoholic, but you don't have time to even think about that because Plutarch jumps right into this. He says, when Alexander was still a boy, his self-restraint showed itself in the fact that, although he was impetuous and violent in other matters, the pleasures of the body had little hold on him, and he indulged with them in great moderation, while his ambition kept his spirit serious and lofty in advance of his years. For it was neither every kind of fame nor fame from every source that he courted, as Philip did. But Alexander instead craved only the highest competition. And so at one point, someone asked him whether he would be willing to contend in the foot race at the Olympic Games since he was a fast runner. And Alexander said yes, but only if I could have kings as my contestants. And so the first part of this is self-explanatory. Alexander, Plutarch says, is a temperate person. He's not interested in the pleasures of his body. He's instead very controlled and very reasonable and very rational. And so therefore, he can't be an out-of-control alcoholic because people who are self-restrained and temperate and have no interest in the pleasures of the body, well, that's just not the sort of thing that they get into and they get interested in. But then Plutarch ends this section in an interesting way. He ends it with this pithy statement that Alexander wouldn't want to win a victory at the Olympics unless it was won against kings. Plutarch tells you this because he's trying to convey to you that Alexander's ambition is so great that it forms a kind of control on everything that he does. And so not only is Alexander naturally self-restrained, but also this ambition keeps any kind of temptation to do anything else that might detract from his achievements in line. Because what Alexander is doing is he is competing against other kings. And so what you see in this section from chapter 4 to the end of chapter 4:10 is an argument against the idea that Alexander's alcoholism was a significant problem. It starts with that stupid argument about his body being overly hot, and so he has to drink a lot to cool it down. But that just sets up a more nuanced and more persuasive argument, an argument that Alexander had self-restraint throughout his life, both because this is his natural character and also because his ambition to achieve wonderful things kept him on the kind of straight and narrow. And so this bad argument of the hot nature of his body and this relatively good argument about his self-restraint come together so they can collectively counteract the claim that Alexander had a drinking problem that made him basically uncontrollable. And this is the central idea in Plutarch's work, that Alexander's competitiveness, his ambition, and his dedication to being the best king possible made him blend justice and ambition. And Plutarch then gives a series of stories that show how even early in his life, Alexander embraced and began working towards this goal. So Plutarch describes, for example, an embassy from the Persian king that Alexander met when the ambassadors came to Philip's court. At this point, Alexander was still a young child, but he asked a series of questions to the ambassadors about the Persian military, the geography of the empire, the particular terrain in which one might fight, and the characteristics of the Persians. Plutarch tells us that Alexander very quickly learned these sorts of things because he understood them to be advantageous. And as we get into a discussion of Alexander's education, what we see is that Alexander also learns that his initial teachers could only provide so much information. And so he learned everything that they could provide, and then to keep his education going, Philip was forced to hire Aristotle to come from Athens and teach Alexander at the court of the king. Plutarch also gives us a famous story that shows the innate quality of sort of fine-tuned observation that Alexander has. So he gives us the story of Bucephalus, Alexander's horse. And Alexander's horse is a wild, very beautiful, but very strong and aggressive horse that no one could tame, and only Alexander dared to approach. But Alexander, of course, succeeds in taming the horse because of his great wisdom and his perceptiveness. What Alexander realizes is the horse freaked out because the horse was afraid of his shadow. And Alexander saw this, and then he figured out how to get Bucephalus to not see his shadow, and at this point, Alexander had the horse that he would ride for the rest of his life. Now, all of this led up to the moment when Alexander would take control of the Macedonian kingdom, and Plutarch narrates this in a little bit of detail. It happened because of a series of quarrels that erupted around the time that Philip, Alexander's father, married a woman named Cleopatra. Not the famous Cleopatra, but another Cleopatra. The name Cleopatra is actually quite common among Macedonians. Alexander, Olympias, and Philip had been arguing with each other in the run-up to the wedding. But on the evening of the wedding, Philip is killed by somebody else. And so while people suspected that Alexander might have been responsible for this, nothing could be proven, and no one was able to contest Alexander taking control of the kingdom. Now, if you remember from when we talked about Alexander's career, the first months of his reign were full of challenges. The first sets of campaigns that he had to wage against the Illyrians, and then the revolt in Greece that led to the destruction of Thebes. And to Greeks at the time, the destruction of Thebes is absolutely horrifying. But Plutarch didn't want to describe Alexander as a monster, at least not yet. What he wants is instead Alexander to be an ambitious commander who is virtuous and restrained. And also, when he rules things that he's conquered, he rules them justly and reasonably. But the destruction of Thebes presents Plutarch with a really significant problem, because he somehow had to make Alexander appear to be a Greek model king in spite of the destruction of Thebes. And what we see here is Plutarch become a really skilled biographical narrator. Because what Plutarch does is he creates a way to make the destruction of Thebes seem justified. So he justifies the destruction of Thebes initially. He spends as little time as possible speaking about the horrors of it. And then he spends a lot of time including stories that show that despite these horrors, Alexander remained just and merciful. And so the chapters surrounding the destruction of Thebes are full of this kind of building up and shaping the way information is presented so that the vision of Alexander is consistent. And the horror that might undercut that vision is downplayed as significantly as Plutarch can do. So after Thebes revolted, what Plutarch says is, Alexander arrives outside of it, and he wished to give Thebes a chance to repent of what she'd done. And so he merely demanded the surrender of Phoenix and Prothletes, the two men who had led this. And he proclaimed an amnesty for those who came forward or came over to his side. But the Thebans made a counter-demand, that Alexander should surrender to them Philotas and Antipater, and made a counter-proclamation that all who wished to help in setting Greece free should range themselves with Thebes. And so Alexander set his Macedonians to the work of war. And so what Plutarch has done here is he said, when Alexander shows up at Thebes, he gives them the chance to repent. And he actually only demands the surrender of the two people who organized this revolt. This is completely reasonable. But the Thebans, instead of acceding to this reasonable demand, instead they turn it down and they make an absurd demand instead. Instead of trying to negotiate with Alexander, what they do is they basically say, no, and you make a demand of us, we're going to make an equally absurd demand from you. We want you to surrender the two commanders who had been most responsible for suppressing Thebes. So Alexander, according to Plutarch, has no choice. He has to attack the city. He was given no other option by the inflexibility of the Thebans. And so this is how the attack on Thebes is justified. It's justified as something that the intransigence of the Thebans meant that Alexander had no other choice. And so then the city is taken, plundered, and razed to the ground. And this is done, Plutarch says, in the main because Alexander expected that the Greeks would be terrified by so great a disaster and would cower down in quiet. And so after separating out the priests, all who were the friends of the Macedonians, the descendants of the poet Pindar, and those who had voted against the revolt, he sold the rest into slavery. And they proved to be more than 30,000 people. Those who had been slain were more than 6,000. And so Alexander destroys the city of Thebes and sells most of its population into slavery, except for those who either had religious duties or had connections to the Macedonians. But look how quickly that happened. So Plutarch describes the destruction of an entire population, the destruction of basically an entire city, and the genocide of the people who lived in it. But he does it in two sentences. It's as short as one can imagine. And Plutarch makes it seem that Alexander and his destruction of Thebes was done for a really strategic reason. He had to do it because the Thebans were inflexible, and he also needed to set an example for the Greeks so that they would not actually follow in the path of the Thebans and cause him to fight them as well. And Plutarch says, even after the city was taken, much of what Plutarch describes is actually the mercy of Alexander, separating out people who were not to be massacred, separating out people who were not to be sold into slavery. But Plutarch further supports the idea that Alexander was a good and merciful conqueror by telling the story of a woman named Timoclea, a woman of noble family who was raped by some of Alexander's soldiers. Now, after the soldier raped her, the soldier asked her if she had any gold or silver in her family, in her household. And Plutarch then continues the story this way. Timoclea admitted that she had, and after leading him by himself into the garden and showing him a well, she told him that when the city was taken, she had with her own hands cast in there her most valuable possessions. And then, as the Thracian soldier was bending over and inspecting the place, she came up behind him, pushed him in, and threw many stones down upon him and killed him. Now, when the Thracians led her, with her hands bound, to Alexander, she showed by her bearing and her gait that she was a person of great dignity and lofty spirit. So calmly and fearlessly did she follow her conductors. And when the king asked her who she was, she replied that she was the sister of Diogenes, who had drawn up the forces which fought Philip on behalf of the liberty of the Greeks and fell in the command at Chaeronea. Amazed, therefore, at her reply and at what she'd done, Alexander told her to depart in freedom with her children. So this is, of course, a gripping story. But this is a story that Plutarch spends a lot of time telling. Look how long this is compared to, this is the destruction of Thebes, quite short. This is the story of Timoclea. It starts even before this, and it continues all the way through here. There's about 3 times as much emphasis on Timoclea as there is on the actual horror of the destruction of Thebes. And this is completely by design, because what this shows is Alexander is behaving justly. Alexander is behaving in a way that respects the rights of individuals, he respects the nobility of people who deserve this, and he stands up for Timoclea without punishing her, because there was wrong done to her, contrary to what should have been done to her. And so Plutarch tells this story in a way to bookend the destruction of Thebes. Remember, the destruction of Thebes is set up by the Thebans being unwilling to negotiate with Alexander. Then the destruction of Thebes happens, but it happens very quickly in the text. And then we have this long story that shows Alexander's mercy. What Plutarch is doing then is he is trying to downplay the horror of the destruction of Thebes, and not by saying there was no horror when Thebes was destroyed, but instead by spending a lot of time saying other things. Things that show Alexander behaving in a way that's just as opposed to a way that is vicious. And so when you read these anecdotes, what you have is a lot more of an impression of Alexander's justice, because the viciousness of Alexander in destroying the city of Thebes is downplayed. It's, in a sense, outweighed by all of the other details that concern Alexander and reflect his good behavior. Now, in this same section of the text, Plutarch tells another one of the most famous stories about Alexander. So after the destruction of Thebes, Alexander calls a conference of all the leading Greek states to get them to again agree to his leadership in the campaign against Persia. And at this conference, we're told that many statesmen and philosophers came to him with their congratulations, and Alexander expected that Diogenes the Cynic, Diogenes of Sinope, who was also in Corinth when the conference was taking place, would also come to Alexander. But since that philosopher took not the slightest notice of Alexander and continued to enjoy his leisure in the suburb of Cronion, Alexander went in person to see him, and he found Diogenes lying in the sun. Diogenes raised himself up a little when he saw so many people coming towards him, and he fixed his eyes upon Alexander. And when that monarch addressed him with greetings and asked him if he wanted anything, "Yes," Diogenes said, "stand a little bit out of my sun." And it's said that Alexander was so struck by this, and so admired the haughtiness and grandeur of the man who had nothing but scorn for him, that he said to his followers, who were laughing and jesting about the philosopher as they went away, "But truly, if I weren't Alexander, I would be Diogenes." So this is one of the most famous stories told about Alexander, and it works on a number of different levels to show something about his character. First, it begins by telling how many philosophers came to Alexander, but he was sophisticated enough to realize that Diogenes the Cynic was the most important one, and that Diogenes did not turn up. And Alexander recognized true philosophical achievement and understood that of all of these philosophers, many were false. Diogenes was the real thing. And so that's one thing that attests to the discretion of Alexander. Second, that this indicates that Alexander thought it was important enough to seek Diogenes out and to speak with him. Third, when Diogenes is rude to Alexander, the most powerful man in Greece, Alexander doesn't punish him. Instead, Alexander understands the wisdom of this man who had no interest in any material good or worldly honor, and he claims that he would want to be like Diogenes if he were not already Alexander. And so Alexander then is the embodiment of the wise philosophical Greek ruler. He's a figure who recognizes true philosophy, he respects true philosophy, and he understands how that true philosophy must be, those true philosophers must be treated even by someone as powerful as him. So this characterization of Alexander as a wise, just, and philosophical Greek ruler continues as he moves into Persian territory. So when Alexander reaches the site of Troy, for example, Plutarch tells us that he visited the grave of Achilles, but of course refuses to visit the tomb of Paris. Achilles was the great hero of the Trojan War, and Paris was the soft, effete Trojan who started it. And so Achilles is the heroic Greek figure, and Paris is, at least in Alexander's construction or conception, the stereotypical weak Persian. And so Plutarch is making clear that Alexander is the rough, tough Greek conqueror who will do to Persia what the Achaeans did to Troy. But the most memorable little story from Alexander's first part of his time in Persia is the story of the Gordian knot. So after Alexander won an initial victory over Persian forces at the Battle of the Granicus, he pressed on to the cities of Asia Minor. And he got to the city of Gordian, which was supposedly the home city of King Midas, the king with the golden touch. And Alexander stopped by the local tourist attraction in that town. And so this is Alexander and the Gordian knot, and this is the description of it. The Gordian knot was a wagon that had fastened to its yoke a very, very difficult knot that was so complicated that it was said that whoever could untie this knot was destined to become the king of the whole world. And most writers say that since the fastenings had their ends concealed and were intertwined many times in crooked coils, Alexander was at a loss about how to proceed. But finally, he loosened the knot by cutting through it with his sword. And that when it was thus cut, many ends were to be seen. But another person, Aristobulus, said that Alexander undid it very easily by simply taking out the pin of the wagon pole, which the yoke was holding the yoke together, and he pulled away the yoke, and therefore the knot just fell apart. Both versions of the story, that told by Plutarch and then the parallel version by Aristobulus, have the same basic point. What they show is that Alexander had the wisdom and intelligence to think outside of the box. So everybody else who tried to deal with the Gordian knot couldn't figure out how to do it because no one could find the ends of it. But what Alexander did was he just looked at it and said, well, there's a simpler way to do it. And either he cut the knot or he pulled out the pin around which the knot was held together, and this allowed the knot to come apart very quickly. But the story works, of course, because not only does it show Alexander's brilliance, but it also seems to predict something that we all know is true, that Alexander would eventually take over the world. And so these are a few of the examples of the kind of wise, virtuous, and forward-thinking approach to life and approach to governing that Alexander seems to embody. This is still the character of the ambitious and self-controlled, virtuous king. But in Plutarch's telling, the wise, just, and philosophical Greek king begins to disappear as Alexander comes closer to accomplishing his goal of conquering Persia. And so we begin to see things like the burning of Persepolis come up. Completely unnecessary violence that flies in the face of the old way that Alexander had behaved. And once the conquest of Persia is complete, Plutarch indicates that Alexander had begun to behave very differently. So instead of a Greek king who ruled Persia, the Achilles to Darius's Paris, Alexander instead becomes increasingly Persian. He begins to wear Persian clothing, he attempts to get Greeks to adopt Persian customs, he marries Roxana, a non-Greek princess, and as he becomes more Persian, he loses his sense of justice. And of course, this is connected to the fact that he has achieved his ambition of becoming the greatest conqueror in the world. So whereas earlier in the work, Alexander laughed off a rumor that one of his advisors was trying to kill him, after the conquest of Persia was complete and Alexander's ambition is in a sense kind of out of control, Alexander signs off on the murder of a number of his closest associates because, in essence, the things that had restrained him were no longer as powerful restraints as they had been at the beginning. And then he embarks on the invasion of India. And this, Plutarch suggests, is full of glory but otherwise had little point. This was an ambitious undertaking done simply for the sake of Alexander's ambition. And at the end of it, Alexander is forced to turn back before completing the conquest of the country when his Greek soldiers refused to go any further. And Plutarch then describes an Alexander who sulks for a number of days before he agrees to return to the west. And as an act of vengeance, Alexander orders his men, these men who had fought with him across 3,000 miles, to march through desert territory in the southern part of Persia, and nearly 3/4 of them die en route. Then as Alexander's forces enter the Persian heartland, Alexander and his men go on a 7-day drinking binge. And then finally, once Alexander sets up in Persia, it becomes clear that he's fully embraced Persian behaviors. So he starts distributing large sums of money to women, as Plutarch says was the custom of Persian kings. He orders the execution of a Macedonian who had robbed the tomb of Cyrus, which is an odd thing given that Alexander himself had sent goods back from Persia to the Greek cities that the Persians had sacked in the 5th century BC. And not only does Alexander punish the robber, but he also orders a Greek translation of Cyrus the Great's funeral inscription to be set up. Now, in practical terms, this is a way of joining his own Greek dynasty to the Persian dynasty that preceded it. But for Plutarch, this is problematic. What Plutarch really doesn't see as ideal is this sort of moving away from the Greek qualities that the self-restrained and ambitious Alexander had embraced. And so by the time that Alexander dies, what Plutarch talks about is a figure who was beginning to lose himself. And though he was only in his early 30s, Plutarch intimates that Alexander had not only lost his bearings, but he'd also kind of used up his life. And so this gets to the point of Plutarch's portrait. What Plutarch is trying to do is a couple of things. First, he wants to investigate the question of how ambitious character traits play out over the course of a life. And then second, he wanted to consider the possible problems with Alexander's embrace of Persian behaviors following the conquest of Persia. Now, in the end, the first characteristic, this question of how ambition plays out across somebody's life, is one that we find echo in the life of Caesar. And when we talk about the life of Caesar next week, that's what we'll focus on. But the second idea is one that is pretty unique to Alexander. Because by the time of Alexander's death, we have to imagine the difficulty that there was, or the difficulty he would have faced being a person like this. Alexander literally at that moment existed in a space that no human in history had ever occupied. No one had ever conquered so much territory so quickly. And this is lonely. Alexander is thoroughly unique in having set an incredibly ambitious goal for himself, and then in achieving that goal so quickly, in a little less than 15 years. But Plutarch suggests that in doing this, he didn't ever lose the ambition that propelled him to try to do this. Instead, that ambition gradually consumed him. And Plutarch believed that ambition, which had earlier created self-restraint and discipline, that ambition overwhelmed Alexander, and it caused Alexander to lose sight of the concern for justice that Alexander had once cultivated so diligently. And so by the end of his life, that ambition had overwhelmed Alexander. But Plutarch felt that on balance, Alexander's life is still an admirable one. That ambition allowed Alexander to achieve a great deal. And even though it began to consume him by the end of Alexander's life, that didn't offset all of the good that Plutarch thought Alexander had done. Now, as we'll see next time, Plutarch felt very differently about Julius Caesar, another person driven by intense ambition, who, despite Plutarch's claims, almost certainly would have had a better case for blending ambition with a commitment to justice than Alexander ever did. So we'll pick up with Caesar next time.